They say that twins share a single soul, a bond forged in the silent, watery darkness of the womb. But for me and my sister Elena, that bond was never a sanctuary. It was a noose. Growing up in our drafty ancestral home on the outskirts of the city, I felt her eyes on me before I even understood what envy was. Elena didn't just want the toys I played with or the ribbons in my hair. She wanted the very air I breathed. She was a master of the mirror, a silent scholar of my existence. I would catch her standing in the hallway, late at night, practicing my specific way of tucking a stray lock of hair behind my left ear, or miming the exact pitch of my laughter until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. To our parents, it was a charming quirk of childhood, a sign of a closeness that they took pride in. But to me, it felt like being stalked by my own shadow. I remember watching her hunched over her desk for hours, not drawing or writing her own thoughts, but painstakingly tracing my signature from a discarded school assignment until the ink bled through the paper. She was waiting, though I didn't know it then, for the moment my life became worth stealing. The atmosphere in our house was always thick with a strange competitive tension that Elena fueled with a quiet, burning intensity. While I sought my own path, studying the complexities of molecular biology and finding solace in the predictable patterns of science, Elena remained stagnant, her only hobby being the curation of my failures and the imitation of my successes. She was a ghost in her own skin, a hollow vessel waiting to be filled by the substance of my life. When I met Mark, I thought I had finally found a world where she couldn't follow. Mark was a man of logic and immense wealth, a brilliant architect whose mind moved in grand blueprints and structural integrity. He loved me for my quiet strength, for the way I handled the complexities of my high-stakes career with a grace he said he had never seen before. He saw a depth in me that he claimed was rare, a hidden garden of thoughts that he wanted to spend the rest of his life exploring. But every time he looked at me with that adoration, I felt a chill, knowing that Elena was nearby, recording the way I smiled back at him, the way I leaned into his touch, and the specific cadence of my voice when I whispered his name. The day Mark proposed was meant to be the beginning of my liberation, the final severance from the suffocating reflection of my sister. We were on the wind-swept cliffs of Amalfi, the Mediterranean sun turning the waves into a mosaic of shattered sapphires. As he dropped to one knee and opened that velvet box, the diamond catching the golden light, I felt a momentary surge of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a blessing, a promise of a future where I was simply myself and not half of a pair. But as he slid that ring onto my finger, a heavy weight of platinum and promise, I glanced toward the distant terrace of the hotel. There, partially obscured by the flowering bougainvillea, stood Elena. She wasn't smiling, and she wasn't crying. She was leaning against a stone pillar with a notebook in her hand, her eyes narrowed in clinical observation. She wasn't watching her sister get engaged. She was studying a performance she intended to master. She was memorizing the exact angle of my head as I cried tears of happiness, the way my hands trembled, and the specific sequence of words I used to say yes. As we returned home and the wedding preparations began, Elena's behavior shifted from passive observation to an active predatory assimilation. She became my shadow more than ever, offering to help with every mundane detail, the dress fittings, the floral arrangements, the seating charts. She insisted on being my maid of honor, a position that gave her total access to my private life. She spent hours in my closet when she thought I wasn't looking, running her fingers over the silk of my bridal gown, her face contorted in a terrifying expression of longing and calculation. I started to notice small things missing: a tube of my favorite lipstick, a pair of worn-in shoes, a backup set of my house keys. When I confronted her, she would merely laugh, a sound that now mirrored mine so perfectly it made my skin crawl, and claim she had just borrowed them for inspiration. But the inspiration she was seeking wasn't for her own life. It was the final polishing of a mask. She was becoming me, cell by cell, habit by habit, while I was too distracted by the mounting pressure of the ceremony and the secret I carried, a secret buried deep in my blood,
documented in a locked file in my study that I foolishly thought she would never find. I believed I was marrying into safety, but I was actually building a stage for the greatest performance of her life, unaware that by the time the bells rang, I would be a ghost in my own story.
The air in the weeks leading up to the wedding was thick with a cloying, artificial sweetness, a frantic energy that Elena channeled into every lace sample and seating chart. I thought it was just the stress of the event, but looking back, I realized I was watching a predator sharpen its claws. She began to isolate me under the guise of sisterly care, insisting that I take rest days while she handled the frantic calls from the caterers and the florist. On the rainy Tuesday before the ceremony, she brought me a cup of herbal tea, her eyes shining with a strange, glassy intensity. "You look exhausted, sister," she whispered, her voice a perfect, haunting echo of my own. "Let me take the burden for a while. You just need to sleep." That was the last thing I remember before the world dissolved into a hazy, gray blur. When I finally clawed my way back to consciousness, the sunlight was stinging my eyes, and my limbs felt like they were made of lead. I wasn't in my bedroom. I was in the small, soundproofed basement of our childhood home, a space our father had used for his woodworking, long since abandoned. My wrists were bound with soft silk scarves, a cruel, elegant touch that only Elena would think of. I tried to scream, but my throat was a desert. Through a small, high window near the ceiling, I heard the distant, joyful peal of church bells. It was the morning of my wedding. Fear, cold and sharp, sliced through the sedative fog still clouding my brain. I struggled against the silk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the knots were professional, calculated. On a small wooden stool just out of my reach sat a single mirror and a note written in my own flawless cursive. "Don't worry," it read. "I won't let him notice the difference. After all, I've practiced being you my entire life. It's my turn to be the lucky one." The realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just stealing a dress or a ring. She was stealing my soul's destination. Across town, I knew exactly what was happening. Elena would be stepping into my Vera Wang gown, the silk sliding over her skin as if it belonged there. She would be applying my signature scent, Santal 33, and painting her lips in the exact shade of dusty rose I had chosen months ago. She would walk into that cathedral, and even Mark, with his brilliant analytical mind, would be deceived by the superficial perfection of the mask. He would see the woman he loved, not realizing that the light in her eyes was born of theft, not devotion. I threw my weight against the cold stone wall, the desperation turning into a silent roar in my chest. I had to get out, not just to save my marriage, but to save Mark from the void she was leading him into. As the hours ticked by, the silence of the basement became a torture chamber of imagination. I pictured Mark standing at the altar, adjusting his cufflinks, his face breaking into that specific lopsided grin when he saw me walking down the aisle. I imagined the priest asking for the vows, and Elena's voice, my voice, promising a lifetime of loyalty she had already betrayed. But beneath the terror and the heartbreak, a dark, cold irony began to root in my mind. Elena had spent years studying the surface of my life, the clothes, the walk, the social graces, but she had never looked beneath the skin. In her haste to occupy my throne, she had neglected to check the foundation. She didn't know about the specialist appointments I had attended in secret over the last 6 months. She didn't know about the tremors I hid with caffeine and sheer willpower, or the genetic ticking clock that had turned my blood into a countdown. She had fought so hard to climb into my life, unaware that she was actually climbing into a gilded cage that was already beginning to rust. As the evening shadows lengthened across the basement floor, I stopped fighting the silk and started thinking. She wanted my life? Fine. She could have the wedding, the husband, and the mansion. But she had no idea that she had just signed a contract with a ghost, inheriting a fate that no amount of stolen diamonds could ever fix.
The cathedral was a masterpiece of cold marble and soaring arches, filled with the scent of 5,000 lilies that I had personally selected months ago. But as I sat huddled in the damp darkness of the basement, my mind traveled through the stone walls, visualizing the scene with agonizing clarity. Elena would be standing there, draped in ivory silk, her face veiled in a delicate mist of tulle that obscured the predatory triumph in her eyes. I could almost hear the low, melodic hum of the organ vibrating through the floorboards, a funeral dirge for my identity. Mark would be waiting at the altar, his posture perfect, his heart full of a devotion meant for a woman who was currently bound in a cellar. I imagined him reaching out to take her hand, his fingers brushing against the skin she had scrubbed and moisturized to match my own, never sensing the shivering cold of the soul beneath. The priest's voice would be echoing through the nave, speaking of sacred bonds and eternal promises, words that Elena was devouring like a starving wolf. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was colonizing a life, planting her flag in the territory of my soul and declaring herself the rightful ruler of everything I had built. The ceremony moved forward in my mind like a slow-motion car crash, beautiful and horrific. I pictured the moment they exchanged rings, the heavy gold bands that were supposed to symbolize a circle of trust. When she spoke her vows, using the soft, breathy cadence she had stolen from me during those late-night practice sessions, I wondered if her conscience felt even a flicker of hesitation. Probably not. To Elena, this wasn't a crime, it was a correction of a cosmic mistake. She believed she deserved my happiness, my husband, and my future. As the congregation rose to applaud the new couple, I felt a jagged piece of glass from a broken crate near my feet. I began to saw at the silk scarves around my wrists, the friction burning my skin, but the physical pain was a mercy compared to the mental image of Mark leaning in to kiss the impostor. He would taste my lipstick on her lips, smell my perfume on her neck, and believe he was starting the first day of the rest of his life. He had no idea that he was kissing a ghost, a hollow shell filled with nothing but envy and stolen memories. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks of crimson across the basement floor, I knew the reception would be in full swing. The champagne would be flowing, the toasts would be filled with laughter, and Elena would be dancing in Mark's arms, spinning in a blur of white lace. She would be playing the part of the radiant bride to perfection, mimicking my shy smiles and the specific way I leaned my head against his shoulder when I was tired. But as I finally felt the silk give way, my hands trembling as the blood rushed back into my numb fingers, a cold, crystalline calm settled over me. Elena had won the battle of the surface. She had the ring, the title, and the man. But in her frantic rush to step into my shoes, she had failed to look at the medical bracelet I usually wore, the one I had hidden in a drawer for the wedding day so it wouldn't ruin the photos. She didn't know that the fainting spells I had complained about weren't from nervous jitters, but the first signs of a nervous system beginning to unravel. She had stolen the crown, but she had also inherited the thorns, and the clock on our shared biology was ticking louder than she could ever imagine. I stood up, my legs weak but my mind sharp, ready to let her enjoy her stolen honeymoon before the inheritance she truly deserved began to take hold. The honeymoon was a fever dream of sun-drenched balconies and expensive champagne, a performance Elena played with the chilling precision of a seasoned assassin. In the grand suites of the Amalfi Coast, she inhabited my skin with a terrifying ease, answering to my name and responding to Mark's touch with a mimicked passion that I could only imagine from my shadow. But as the initial adrenaline of the theft began to wane, the first cracks in her stolen masterpiece started to appear, not in her acting, but in the body she had claimed as her own. It began with a subtle tremor in her right hand as she held a crystal flute of mimosa, a microscopic quiver that she initially dismissed as the lingering excitement of the wedding.
She didn't see the way her pupils occasionally failed to constrict in the bright Italian sun, or the way her gait lost its rhythmic symmetry for a fraction of a second when she walked across the marble lobby. She was too busy basking in the reflection of Mark's adoration, unaware that the physical vessel she had hijacked was a ticking time bomb of genetic malfunction. She had stolen my identity, yes, but she had also stepped into the path of a silent predatory disease that I had spent the last year documenting in secret. Back at our new estate, the routine of our life began to weigh on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Mark wasn't just a husband, he was a man who noticed the smallest shifts in energy, and Elena had to work double shifts to maintain the facade. Every morning she had to remember my coffee order, black with a single grain of sea salt, and every evening she had to recount stories of a childhood she had shared but never truly experienced from my perspective. But the psychological strain was nothing compared to the physical betrayal. The headaches started in the second month, sharp, white-hot needles of pain that bloomed behind her eyes and left her gasping for air in the sanctuary of the ensuite. She found my stash of specialized supplements, the ones I had labeled as simple vitamins, and swallowed them greedily, hoping to dull the strange electric tingling that was starting to creep up her spine. She thought it was just the stress of the lie, the weight of the crown she had snatched, but as she looked in the mirror, she saw a ghost starting to haunt her own features. Her skin grew pale, and a persistent dull ache settled into her joints, a phantom mirror of the symptoms I had been fighting to suppress before the swap. The most delicious irony was that Elena, in her obsession with the aesthetic of my life, had completely ignored my medical history. She had burned my journals but left the medical portal passwords unchanged, assuming they were just boring records of checkups. One night, while Mark was away on a business trip, the first major episode hit. She collapsed on the Persian rug in the library, her muscles locking in a rigid, agonizing spasm that felt like her bones were trying to exit her skin. It was a focal seizure, the very thing my neurologists had warned me was coming. As she lay there, twitching and unable to call for help, she must have felt the first cold touch of true terror. This wasn't part of the fairy tale. This wasn't the happily ever after she had scripted. She had stolen a life of luxury, but she had failed to realize that the life was attached to a body that was failing. By the time I appeared in the shadows of the doorway, watching her struggle from the safety of the dark, I saw the realization dawning in her glassy eyes. She had won the house, the husband, and the name, but she was now the sole owner of a terminal diagnosis that was only just beginning to show its teeth.
The silence of the estate was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a sound that now seemed to count down the remaining seconds of Elena's stolen sanity. As she lay on the floor, the aftershocks of the seizure still rippling through her nervous system like static on a dying television screen, I finally stepped out from the velvet shadows of the library. I didn't come with a weapon or a shout. I came with the quiet, devastating weight of the truth. Elena's eyes widened, her pupils blown wide with a mixture of neurological trauma and primal terror as she saw my silhouette. She tried to scramble backward, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, a cruel parody of the grace she had worked so hard to mimic. I knelt beside her, not out of sisterly compassion, but to ensure she heard every syllable of the sentence I was about to pass. "You wanted my life, Elena," I whispered, my voice steady and cold, "and you were so thorough in your theft that you didn't just take the husband and the bank accounts, you took the DNA. You took the legacy of a bloodline that has been hiding a monster for generations." I watched the confusion flicker behind her pain, the desperate mind of a grifter trying to find an exit strategy where none existed. I leaned closer, the scent of her expensive, stolen perfume, my perfume, cloying in the air.
I explained the secret I had been hiding, a rare autosomal dominant neurological condition that bypasses the typical laws of aging, lying dormant until a specific environmental or psychological trigger sets it off. For me, the trigger had been the stress of the wedding preparations, but for her, the massive influx of cortisol from the deception and the subsequent seizures had accelerated the onset by decades. I told her about the locked file she had ignored, the one labeled Family Genealogy, which contained the autopsy reports of our grandmother and the aunt we were told had died in a tragic accident. They hadn't died in an accident. They had withered away, their minds dissolving into a chaotic soup of misfiring neurons until they forgot how to breathe. Elena's breath hitched, a ragged, wet sound in the quiet room. She looked down at her trembling hands, the very hands that had signed my name on the marriage certificate, and I saw the moment she realized those hands would soon be unable to hold a spoon, let alone a champagne flute. The genetic trap had snapped shut with a finality that no lawyer could undo. Because she had spent months gaslighting the world into believing she was me, she was now legally bound to the medical history she had inherited. If she tried to claim she was Elena now, she would be institutionalized for a psychotic break, stripped of the wealth she had killed for, and left with nothing. But if she stayed as me, she was the one who had to undergo the grueling experimental treatments I had already signed up for. Treatments that were designed to prolong a life that had become a living prison. I watched the tears track through her expensive foundation, ruining the mask she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She had won the ultimate prize, a life of luxury with a man who would now watch her slowly decompose from the inside out, thinking he was losing the woman he loved. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, feeling a strange, hollow lightness in my chest. I had lost my husband and my home, but in the ultimate irony, the very disease that was meant to be my ending had become my liberation. I was a ghost now, untethered and free, while Elena was the one buried alive in a body that was already beginning to forget her name.
The transition was finally complete, but not in the way Elena had envisioned in her feverish dreams of grandeur. As the months bled into a hazy continuum of specialist appointments and hushed conversations in marble hallways, the luxury she had craved became a clinical cage. Mark, ever the devoted architect of our lives, built a world of accessible ramps and soft lighting, his eyes perpetually clouded with a grief he couldn't name. He watched me, the woman wearing my face, wither into a fragile shadow of the vibrant bride he had married. He spent his fortune on experimental therapies and private nurses, his devotion a constant, agonizing reminder to Elena of the love she had stolen but could never truly possess. She was trapped in a silent scream, her vocal cords occasionally failing her, leaving her to stare at him with a desperation he mistook for the progression of the disease. She had the man, she had the mansion, and she had the name, but she was a prisoner of the very biology she had fought so hard to claim as her own. I watched from the fringes of her new reality, a literal ghost in the city we once shared. Using the offshore accounts I had quietly established before the wedding, funds Elena never found because she was too busy counting the family diamonds, I moved into a small, sun-drenched cottage by the sea. Without the suffocating weight of my old identity and the constant crushing stress of maintaining the perfect facade, my own symptoms remained miraculously dormant, a clinical anomaly that my doctors had always said was possible, but rare. I was no longer the tragic heiress or the sick twin. I was a woman without a past, breathing air that didn't taste of envy. Sometimes I would drive past the estate and see them through the iron gates, Mark pushing her in a high-tech wheelchair through the rose gardens I had planted. He would lean down to kiss her forehead, a gesture of pure, heartbreaking loyalty,
and I would see Elena's eyes flash with a momentary lucid terror. She knew that if she spoke the truth, she would lose the only thing keeping her alive, but by staying silent, she was being erased by the very life she had coveted. The final mirror was the most poetic of all. In the end, Elena didn't just look like me, she became the version of me that I was always terrified of becoming. She lived out my nightmare so that I didn't have to. On the rare nights when the wind blows from the city toward the coast, I think about the note I left tucked into the back of a frame in the library, a frame holding a photo of us as children, identical and smiling. The note simply says, "Be careful what you wish for, because you might just get everything." Mark will find it eventually, perhaps years from now, when the woman in the bed is a stranger even to herself. But for now, the play continues. The curtain is up, the audience is captivated, and Elena is forced to perform the role of a dying woman until the very last act. I turned away from the gates for the last time, the salt spray of the ocean washing the last traces of my sister's scent from my skin, finally free to be the only person she could never figure out how to be, myself.